Thank you for for allowing me to share. I am so proud of this. Thank you. Today I will talk about Elephantine Museum. It is so far from Minia, but it is very important as provincial museum because of many reasons. We can begin the story with the decisions for establishing or creating provincial museums in Egypt that was managed by Maspero. And the beginning was at the same time for most of provincial museums in Egypt, Tanta, Asyut, but Asyut was exception because it was private museum of Sayyid Basha Khashaba, Bursaid, Ismailia, many museums, many provincial museums were allowed to begin with the end of the first decade of 20th century. Some of these museums vanished so fast, and some of them continued. For Maspero, as he reported that Asyut Museum, the private museum of Sayyid Basha Khashaba, and Elephantine Museum were the most successful projects of provincial museums in Egypt. It was the beginning. Firstly, I will talk about the start. There were many attempts to establish provincial museum in Aswan, but it didn't work. Mainly by the Antiquity Service, and earlier attempt was by Dr. Kani Leaf, who the British resident therapist in Aswan, who applied for erecting a museum in Aswan in 1905, but Maspero welcomed, but he stipulated many points that should be saved in this museum. Dr. Ghani and his group of foreign tourists didn't apply and didn't achieve or carry out these stipulations, so the idea vanished. In 1908, Maspero announced that the budget of the Antiquity Service cannot cover the establishment of buildings for provincial museums or for museums in general. Maspero resorted to the Public Works Ministry and the British responsibles for Aswan Dam project, where was the secret word behind establishing Elephantine Museum. It was the importance of being on good working terms with officials or other departments. Before choosing the present building to be Aswan Museum, there were many attempts, as we said about Dr. Kenny Leaf, and another attempt or another proposal was offered by the Antiquity Service Inspector Arthur Weigel, who suggested in the summer of 1910 to establish Aswan Museum. And it was the first prospect that I can read about how can the museum in Aswan be shaped. According to the words of Arthur Weigel's suggestion, it would be splendid to have, he said, it would be splendid to have a series of rooms chronologically illustrating the whole history of Lower Nubia, and a mass of photos on the walls of everything found there, and all the temples there also. The suggestion of Weigel did not come true, although it was genius one, because he intended to record the history of Lower Nubia as it should be. Maspero visited the area and wanted to carry out the project, so he depended finally on the Public Works ministry to establish this museum. He, by the help of Ismail Sirri, the Minister of Public Works, and Harvey, the British high official, could manage the project and carry it out in the residence for the officials of the antiquities and engineers of Aswan. Maspero chose Cecil Firth to arrange the collection of the museum. And when he visited him later, he announced that he admired the arrangement of Cecil Firth. Maspero announced in 1910 the birth of Elephantine Museum. The most important two issues related to Elephantine Museum was, firstly, saving the museum gardens under the authority of the Antiquities Service. And it was my first time to read about garden in the museum and its importance. The second point for Maspero was, or for the Antiquities Administration in Egypt, was supplying the museum with enough guarding security. For this second problem, Maspero suggested for the first time hiring insurance company that can be responsible for securing the museum and its valuable collection. But this did not come true. And finally, Maspero depended on the Ministry of Interior to save enough security for Elephantine Museum. I followed the alterations that happened in the museum, but I found it very few. I found a description for the museum written in 1930s by James Beakey, and another one by Labib Habashi in 1959, but I found no difference, no big difference between the two descriptions. So we can deduce that, or conclude that the museum is special museum, Elephantine, because it continued opened for a very long time, but without development for its shape or its collection. With more political spirit in 1949, the Egyptian government planned and announced to establish Archaeological Institute and Educational Museum on Elephantine Island, which was known as Farouk the First Institute and Educational Museum, with initial funding of 8,000 Egyptian pounds. The target of the institute and the museum is to conserve and study not the Nubian heritage, but the common civilization of Egypt and Sudan. After 1952 revolution, Elephantine Museum continued open, but undeveloped until 1973, when new plans for developing the museum were proposed by the British Museum curator and the Egyptologist Eden Stephen Edward. This happened as a result of an official meeting with Dr. Gamal Mukhtar, who suggested on Edward, and Edward reported to the British authorities his proposal, which did not come true because it was contemporaneous to a British aid loan that was offered to the Egyptian government. The time of offering this loan was 1972, just 2 or 4 months before 1973 war. So the loan was not used in developing Elephantine Museum. Now we will see what we have on the PowerPoint. Now I'd like to be sure if the slide moved. Okay. Okay. Here is photo for foundation tablet for Aswan Dam, Low Aswan Dam, which was begun in 1898, and the first rising ended in 1912, and another rising happened in 1932, finished in 1932. And these three projects produced a big collection from antiquities collection that didn't find another place to be preserved except Elephantine Museum. And the original museum that the original collection that was placed in Elephantine Museum was a result of this archaeological survey, but that was carried out by Reisner in 1907 and continued until 1910. Here one of the rare photos that I found for Elephantine Museum, and why it is important from my modest point of view, because of its collection, of course, which pushed Maspero one day to think about hiring insurance company to protect and save the collection of the museum. Second thing for why Elephantine Museum is important, the durability of it as a tourist destination. And third point is the distinguished style of the museum, which was built by granite. So it preserved the building for a long time, and now it is a same building, of course with annexes, but the original construction of the museum is still with one floor and 2 rooms on each side. Here is a proof for being this museum important for visitors. We can read this statistics for the number of visitors during all the months of the year. Of course, during summer months, the number is fewer, but it is continuous. Always this museum had its visitors. The masterpieces of Elephantine Museum, as you can see, it is of course not my area, so and yours, not me, but I can refer to the original collections of this museum. As I said before, George Reisner, Cecil Firth collection, and the 1950s and 1960s survey, archaeological survey of Nubia. And some of these pieces now are in Nubia Museum because Elephantine Museum is closed for restoration. Now we will tackle the history of the museum through the slides. Elephantine was tourist destination even before Elephantine Museum, before the museum. We can read here in Le Débat that this is a kind of tourist program of visits, and in it you can find the Lyle, the Elephantine, which was part. But for what? For which reason? The archaeological features on this island was not clear enough as what happened after, but the main attractive for Elephantine Island was the gardens, the palm trees, the plants of this area, which attracted visitors, especially to come and see it. Here are Voyager, one of Voyager books that describe the gardens of Elephantine before the museum, 1897. And here is very important feature, so near from Elephantine Museum. It is an nilometer, which continued for long time of Egypt's history, was closed in Middle Ages and reopened under the reign of Khedive Ismail, with during the second part of the 19th century. Here is a photo for, I'm sorry, I tried to find photo for Dr. Lev Kani, who proposed in 1905 the first museum in Aswan. Of course, it was not in Elephantine, but I couldn't find a photo for him, so I decided to use this photo for his house in Aswan also, because he lived in Aswan for many decades and established his own house there that is continued up till now. You can see it there in Aswan. Arthur Weigel, the antiquarian or British antiquities inspector who worked for the in the Antiquities Service as inspector and spent a long time in Aswan. So by nature, he was following what is happening in Elephantine Museum, and he proposed the first shape, what should be for Elephantine, for Aswan Museum. But this did not come true. His suggestion did not come true because of the absence of enough fund. Here is the session or procès-verbal of Comité d'Egyptologie, in which Maspero announced that there is no budget for erecting museums. And after that, it was the movement towards private museums as it appeared in Asyut by Said Khashaba, and depending on the power and authorities and buildings of public works ministry, as what happened in Elephantine Museum, to create provincial museums. I'd like to add that one of the suggestions of Maspero that didn't come true also, that he wanted the municipality of Aswan to establish and fund Aswan Museum, but it was not, there was no available fund to establish this project. Here is the session of the Comité d'Egyptologie, in which Maspero announced the establishment of Aswan Museum. And I'd like to add that the sessions or the procès-verbal of Comité d'Egyptologie is main source to study the history of museums in Egypt, because one of its two main concerns is following and supervising and suggesting and following the carrying out of these suggestions concerning the museums. Now we will return to the garden of the museum, which was so important that it was discussed in the sessions of the Comité d'Egyptologie and how to preserve it. We can see here old photo for the part of this garden and its plants. And I think the session of the Comité d'Egyptologie in which this point was discussed deserve to be printed again and again, how the antiquarians looked after this point and tried to preserve the garden as possible. And the main problem, of course, was the absence of enough fund. I tried to follow what happened for this garden, because I just read about it in the sessions of Comité d'Egyptologie in 1913, and then nothing more about this garden. But I found Edward in 1973 in his report about Elephantine Museum say that the modest building standing in a well-kept garden on Elephantine. So I could conclude that the garden survived. Here is the Cecil mission organizing the collection of Elephantine Museum. Here we can see a photo for him and the decision of the report of Maspero, which included this fact, and letter from Perth to Weigel, to Arthur Weigel, documenting also the admiration of Maspero with his work as the organizer of Elephantine Museum collection. Yes. Here is Maspero report that included his managing for the problems of Elephantine Museum, and this was a report to the Académie de Belles Lettres, and here we can read Maspero how proud was he of Aswan, of Asyut and Aswan museums, and how he solved the problem of security depending on the interior ministry in Egypt. Here are the initiators of Elephantine Museum. The Maspero, who suggested Ismail Serri Basha, the Egyptian Minister of Public Works, who paved the way for this decision to establish the museum in Elephantine, and the British High Official, Paul Harvey, who supported the establishment of the museum. From this slide, we can conclude that not always what we know about certain personalities can be everything. Paul Harvey is known for his hard political decisions, but for museums, he was a gift. Here in the report of Maspero, he is documenting the existence of Elephantine Museum, and it was not called Elephantine Museum. Now we say Elephantine Museum to differentiate between it and Nubian Museum, but during the first half of 20th century, it was known as Aswan Museum or Jazirat Aswan Museum. Here is early description for the museum collection that was mentioned in James Bakey book, and as you can read it, it is of course he describes so briefly the collection, and so proud of the Khnum, which gilded mummified Khnum, which is now in the Nubian Museum. And here is another description for the museum by Labib Habashi in 1950s. And when you read it, you cannot find big difference between the museum collection. Of course, it increased by the archaeological survey of 1960s and 50s, but the original collection seems to be the same. Here is the Egyptian. Through this slide, we can see the Egyptian attitude towards the museum's rule in 1949, when the decision with erecting or with establishing a museum and institute Educational Museum and Institute for Archaeology on the same place, Elephantine Island, was issued by King Farouk, but I didn't find evidences that this project became true. And the target of this museum seems to be more political one than cultural one, because in this time Egypt tried to prove its strong connection with Sudan, and one of these tools was erecting a special museum and institute to study the common culture and civilization between Egypt and Sudan. This book is very important. It is Arabic book written by Abdel Rahman Zaki, who was director of the military or war museum in Egypt before 1952 revolution. And this book, I consider it record for all kinds of museums and societies in Egypt until 1949. I can send the link if anyone needs it in the future. Here is the decision with establishing Farouk Institute, which did not come true. And even the budget was defined, £18,000, but nothing come true of it. This is another important document concerning Elephantine Museum. Edward Report, British Museum curator, who in July 1972 wrote this report depending on informal conversation with Dr. Gamal Eddin Mukhtar, the director of Antiquity Service in Egypt. In this report, Edward directed the report to the British authorities to push them to carry out development in Elephantine Museum, but the project of Edward, I will read 2 paragraphs of it for you. How great was it, because it followed everything there and suggested even for the garden for this museum. I'm sorry, the electricity is off. Can I read for you, or the time is off now? Okay. I cannot show you the PowerPoint, so I will read because we are the presentation. I can read what Edward wrote about the alterations that should be carried out inside the museum itself. He said air conditioning would be a great help both for the comfort of visitors in hot weather and for reducing the quantity of dust which would enter the cases. Experiences has shown that it is impossible to devise a case with internal lighting which is dust-proof, because when the lights are turned off, the warm air inside the case is expelled and is replaced by dust-laden cool air from the room. Another point that I have chosen from Edward's report, if this suggestion were to be adopted, the first necessity would be to prepare an inventory for all the antiquities which should be included in the compound. It would then be possible to divide them into 3 classes, those which should be displayed in the museum, and those which should stand in the garden, and those which should be put in the study collection. From Edward's report, I could conclude that the annex for Elephantine Museum was not added until 1973 when this report was written. At the end of the report, Edward seems to predict what was going to happen, although this report dates back to 1973, but we can read the last minute he added to this report, He said, perhaps it should be mentioned that the Germans have already been given permission to reconstruct the temple of Amenophis III at Elephantine. It would not be surprising if eventually they were to extend their interest to the neighboring museum, if nothing is done in the meantime to improve its condition. Edward predicted with what happened begun later by the German Institute in Elephantine. And one of the most important references for studying Elephantine is the report of 2018. I'm sorry, it was on my PowerPoint, but I cannot show it in my mobile. The last thing I depended on it is the report of Dr. Dia Abu Ghazi, the first female director for Cairo Museum in 1978, and the first female director for museum sectors. And she wrote her report among a cultural survey that was carried out in 1980. She commented, or she reported Elephantine Museum, that it is very important and distinguished museum without any development, just storerooms were built and added to be able to include the excavated collection. Finally, I would like to give you my conclusion concerning this museum, because it is really a distinguished one. When I began it, I considered it a project that was controlled by political attitudes more than anything. But I found that the beginning of this museum was cooperation between French, British, and the Egyptians. So when this kind of cooperation can be saved, we will find distinguished results for our work. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for the electricity.